Welcome, everybody, and it's very nice to see you here today. Thank you for coming along to this event. It's lovely to be able to welcome you, first of all, to this beautiful building, but to an event that is co-hosted by the Centre for Interdisciplinary Research in Arts and Languages, based at the University of Manchester, and also within that, the Manchester Centre for Correspondence Studies. This year's special theme for research and for all the events in CIDRI, in the Centre for Interdisciplinary Research, is archives. And of course, our special interest in the Centre for Correspondence Studies is letters. And so our speaker today is the perfect speaker who combines interests in and publications in both those areas. So I'm very, very happy that she's here, and I will introduce her shortly. First, I'm asked to do a little housekeeping. Firstly, to say, you will have seen when you came in downstairs, there is a capital project on at the moment. There's some renovation going on. So we have no capacity for offering you a glass of champagne or a cup of tea. So apologies for that. We decided that the beautiful space was still worth being in, even if we couldn't have a cup of tea. So, the warm welcome is still there. I'm asked to tell you that there are toilets in the lower ground floor in the basement, and that there is no fire drill planned for this evening. So if the sirens do go off, we actually do have to leave. It's real. So it won't happen, but we need to be aware of that. You're very welcome to have bottled water. I believe we cannot bring anything in except bottled water into this space, so, for obvious reasons. Tonight's talk is being filmed, and we will pass around a mic at the end for question and answer. The filming will not include the faces of those in the audience, so if that's something that makes you nervous, you don't need to worry about that. Your voices will be heard on the question and answer session at the end. So if you would rather not have your question recorded, we won't be asking names. If you'd rather not have your question recorded, then there will be time afterwards to come and chat to Maria before we have to leave the building. Finally, I think I wasn't asked to tell you about phones, but if you have a really fancy ringtone on your phone, it will be captured for posterity if it goes off while we're recording during the session. So I'd advise if you could turn your ringtone off. I have a colleague who has a recording of a howler monkey as his ringtone, and it goes off in meetings. It's quite unnerving. Okay, so on to the business of the evening. Our speaker tonight is Professor Maria Tamboukou, who is based at the University of East London, and she's Professor of Feminist Studies and has interests in feminist theory, in narrative studies, in gender, and in, as we'll find out, in archives and letters. She's the author or co-author, co-editor of a daunting number of books, something like 14 books, of which 9 are single monographs. These include, just to give you a sample of how well she fits this particular environment today, a co-authored book entitled The Archive Project, Archival Research in the Social Sciences from 2016, and a very recent, I think only just out, Epistolary Narratives, 2024, Epistolary Narratives of Love, Gender and Agonistic Politics, an Arendtian Approach, published by Routledge this year. What she's interested in is really, in one of her works, she describes herself as a narrative researcher. And this is sort of something that is fascinating to me as a specialist in ancient letters. And I've used, in fact, Maria's work, although we are 2,000 years apart in our interest, I've used her work for precisely her approaches to how letters work and how such documents are technologies of the self, as she puts it. And that's something that I find particularly stimulating. She has written articles precisely on letters as technology of the self. She's always very engaged and vivid in her approach to the work. So she's very kind of engaged in narrative as creating feeling states. And she writes wonderfully in her book of 2016 on sewing. Now, let me get the title right. Sewing, writing, and fighting. I wrote fighting and thought, Am I right? Okay, sewing, fighting, and writing. And she says archives are to be taken not only as a laboratory of memory and forgetting, but also as an experimental time-space continuum where memory and imagination are brought together in the study and understanding of documents. And I think that's what we're going to see today. She is currently running a major Leverhulme project, which I'm sure she will tell us about, on numbers and narratives, a feminist genealogy of automythographies. And her talk today is entitled Epistolary Archives and Sensibilities Between the Personal and the Scientific in Women Mathematicians' Correspondence. Maria, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ruth, and for this very warm introduction, but also for this invitation. This is an amazing place to be having a talk. So, in my talk today, I will draw on my current research project of writing a feminist genealogy of automythographies, a concept denoting the autobiographical desire of becoming a mathematician, which was coined by Paul Halmos back in 1985. By gendering Halmos' desire, what I argue is that it is essential to throw light on the social, cultural, and political practices that some women mathematicians deployed in surpassing the restrictions and limitations of their gendered position and follow an academic journey or career in the field of mathematical sciences. In thus working genealogically, I look at the personal, literary, and philosophical writings of 6 women mathematicians: the Italian Maria Gaetana Agnesi, the French Émilie du Châtelet and Sophie Germain, the Scottish Mary Somerville, the English Ada Lovelace, and the Russian Sofia Kovalevskaya. My archival research has also shown that there is a Chinese woman mathematician and astronomer, Wang Zheni, who lived and worked in the 18th century and also wrote poetry and beautiful travel diaries and essays. But apart from some extracts of her work included in short biographical entries, her writings have not been translated in English, so I couldn't have access to them due to language restrictions. I hope that in the future there will be a project that will make her writings accessible to Anglophone readers and international audiences. So, to return to the European women, apart from their mathematical and scientific work, these 6 European women wrote philosophical essays, like Émilie du Châtelet, Sophie Germain, and Ada Lovelace. Mary Somerville and Sofia Kovalevskaya wrote autobiographies, while Sofia Kovalevskaya also wrote poetry, novels, and theatrical plays. What unites them, however, is that they all wrote letters. So letters have become very important in this research. And just to say here that, of course, I'm drawing on their personal writings because their mathematical work has been treated in the literature in the history of mathematics. Okay, so letters in general and epistolarity in particular has been at the heart of my research for several years, and I have written extensively about the intricacies of reading letters in tracing hidden genealogies in women's lives. What I have observed, however, is that the rich body of literature around letters has not considered the importance of scientific correspondences in general and mathematical correspondences in particular in the excavation of the female self, in the technologies of the female self, as Ruth has already mentioned. I have been struck by this omission, and my talk today is precisely on the importance of letters in writing a feminist genealogy of automorphographies. And just to get it right here, I'm not suggesting that women mathematicians' letters have not been discussed at all. Historians of mathematics have occasionally drawn on letters to examine women's conditions, to examine women's contribution to the history of mathematical sciences, and there have been some publications in this area, although the non-English ones have not been translated, like Kovalevskaya's correspondence with her doctoral supervisor, Karl Weierstrass, which is in German, Maria Gaetana's Agnesi with the Riccati family, which is in Italian, or the whole of Amélie de Châtelet's correspondence, which is in French. What we have in all of these cases are some fragments of their letters translated for the purpose of being used as evidence or illustrations of various biographical studies. But such work has been limited in this area, and women mathematicians' letters have not been examined or considered as what Ken Plummer has configured as documents of life, even less so with attention to the epistolary traits of their form. And just to give an example here, this is part of a correspondence between Sophie Germain and the famous Carl Friedrich Gauss. Sophie Germain was a French mathematician, as we have already seen. Of course, she was not allowed to study in the École Polytechnique, which was established just after the French Revolution. So her whole mathematics education was either done in the library or through correspondence. And we will come back to the pedagogical character and tool of mathematical correspondences. So in 1801, she started a correspondence with Carl Friedrich Gauss because he had just written Disquisitiones Arithmetica, and she was interested in number theory. They start a correspondence, but she writes to him as Monsieur Leblanc, which was the name of a male student at the École Polytechnique. But soon after, 4 years after their correspondence had started, the Napoleonic Wars started in Europe. The French troops invaded Prussia, and Germain, of course, is worried about Gauss' safety. So through some family friends, she asks for an officer to be sent to his house in Brunswick to make sure that he's okay. And when the officers arrive there and they say, oh, Mademoiselle Germain was asking about you, he says, but I don't know any Mademoiselle Germain. And so after this, she wrote to him a letter in which she reveals her gender identity. And she also says, I had to use a male name because I didn't want to go through the ridicule that is usually attached to the learned woman, les femmes savantes, obviously referring to Molière's comedy. And the important thing is that in the end of this letter, where she reveals her identity and she talks about her feelings, there are 4 pages of mathematical formulas, proofs, problems. And by the way, your book says this, and I don't think it's correct. And Gauss, of course, responds to this letter. And in the beginning, he expresses his admiration about how amazing it was that she was a woman, and yet she had penetrated, as he writes, the world of mathematics. And in the end of this letter, there are 4 more pages with mathematical proofs and formulas that historians of mathematics today think they are amongst the most important writings of Gauss around number theory, and later on the proof of the Fermat's last theorem. So we see how the personal and the scientific are mingled in this correspondence, and this is where I have identified the gap, that historians of mathematics have focused on the mathematical part of this correspondence, but they haven't really looked into the part where we see these exchanges and the problems of being or trying to become a woman mathematician in post-revolutionary France, okay? So it's very interesting. So, in thus reading women mathematicians' letters, writings to their tutors, supervisors, fellow mathematicians, and even friends and lovers, I have used the lens of what I have configured in my work, epistolary sensibility, meaning the analytical trend of engaging with letters, taking them not just as a document of life amongst others, but paying close attention to their epistolary traits, which include, amongst others, their relational and dialogic character, their ephemerality, the power dynamics of the epistolary relationship, the importance of salutations and greetings, the different time frames of writing a letter, posting it or not, reading it and responding to it or not, the materiality of the epistolary act, as well as the narrative extravagances of letter writing. And I hope as we will go on, I will give you some examples of this. Now, to come to the archives, an important part of my epistolary sensibility has always been the fact that all letters are always already archival documents. And in situating my subject position, I am both a researcher in the archive as well as an external reader of letters, to use Janet Altman's famous configuration. I read a letter that was written for somebody else. In this context, an important aspect of my research is the experience of working in different archives and with different epistolary documents, both analog, digital, digitized, and photographed. And here you see just the range of archives that I have been working with for this project only. I have also worked with published renditions of letters, edited and selected, others full publications, most of them transcribed, but also some published and photographed of the originals, what Lee Stanley has famously theorized as the Earl letters. There is, of course, a burgeoning body of literature around digital and digitized archives and the way they have changed the epistemological nature of archival research in general, and the way we approach, understand, and analyze epistolary documents in particular. Moreover, most archival researchers know by now that even when we work in classic archival spaces, like this library, for example, and have access to analog documents, the scans and photos that we are usually allowed to take, often without restrictions and expenses, have gradually changed the way we experience archival work, as well as the ways we analyze digitized epistolary documents. As Liz Stanley and colleagues have simply put it in creating an online archive for Olive Schreiner's letters, transcriptions are not letters themselves, but then neither are JPEG images of letters, the letters either, but another two-dimensional representation. Contextual loss is amongst the most important epistemological issues in the understanding and analysis of archival documents in general and letters in particular. What is the difference then between reading a handwritten letter in the archive and later its image version in the researcher's desktop, a digitized version of a handwritten letter in an online library or archive, a published version of handwritten letters, or a transcribed and published letter in both historical and contemporary publications? This is what I have considered through the lens of diffraction, a notion that derives from optical physics. As an optical phenomenon in classical physics, diffraction follows the bending of waves as they move through passages or encounter small obstacles. Think of how a rainbow of different colors is being formed when white light enters a prism. What happens when two or more waves arrive at the same point is also interesting, since unlike particles, waves can overlap at the same point in space, creating superposition effects. Consider the all too familiar moment when we throw pebbles in a lake. The waves that appear as an effect of this disturbance interfere with each other in different ways, depending on their properties and corresponding forces. They can create a more intense wave together, producing constructive interferences, or they can cancel each other out in the mode of destructive interferences. The superposition of most waves, however, produces a combination of constructive and destructive interferences, which vary from place to place and time to time. For feminist philosopher Donna Haraway, diffraction becomes a metaphor for the effort to see difference and its effects at the bottom of the mirror or on the surface of a pond. So, following a vibrant body of feminist literature that have deployed diffractive methodologies in research, I have taken diffraction as an approach of reading insights through one another in attending to and responding to the details and specificities of relations of difference. In the case of this lecture, differences in the modalities and forms of epistolary documents. Put simply, diffractive ways of reading and analyzing epistolary documents are not only about how I understand the content and discourse of a letter as a static entity or meaning. It is about how I tune into the various rhythms of meaning and understanding. In the light of wave phenomena, the meanings that are enacted through the reading and analysis of different types of epistolary documents keep creating a variety of superposition effects, producing constructive and destructive interferences. Finally, diffraction changes not only the way I see differences in the epistolary documents by tracing their archival trails, but also how I mark and change my position vis-à-vis the letters I am studying in my attempt to understand the process of becoming a woman mathematician in the 18th and 19th centuries. In the mode of diffraction, then, touching actual letters in physical archives and forms has triggered intense feelings of connection with corporeal and material traces. In short, the tactile properties of the epistolary act, the paper, the envelope, the ink, the handwriting. Touching is a pathway to feeling and understanding, although tactile ways of knowing have been downplayed and devalued. The tactile and visual properties of the epistolary documents are thus entangled in the researcher's perception and understanding, since while the letter in the archive is always visible, it also has a specific smell and even a specific sound, as its pages and leaves are turned while the researcher flicks through them, arranges and rearranges them, immersing themselves in a particular tactile process of making sense. But touch is slow, sight is fast. And indeed, the slowness of the tactile process runs in parallel with the slow rhythms of reading and copying in the archive that Arlette Farce has influentially theorized. And she writes here in this little book, Le Goût de l'Archive, in the digital age, this act of copying can seem quite foolish. Maybe it is. It's true that there is certainly something foolish about always recopying the entirety of a document instead of just taking notes or summarizing its main themes. And it would indeed be foolish, stubborn, maybe even pridefully obsessive if this exact recopying of words did not feel somehow necessary, an exclusive and privileged way of entering into the world of the document as both accomplice and outsider. Elsewhere in my work, I have written about trans situations of making meaning and understanding triggered by the slow process of touching, reading, and copying letters in the archive. But I have also admitted that since the researcher's budget and time are always limited, the real letters will be inevitably scanned and photographed, and it is to their visual images that the researcher will return. This is where the visual and the tactile create superposition effects like the pebbles in the lake. Since it is in the middle of this slow process of touching, reading, copying, and in effect rewriting letters that the researcher's understanding emerges and new ideas and insights arise. In this context, the letters themselves are being transformed. not just as analog or digitized documents, but rather as components of complex entanglements between the analog and the digital within the space-time matter of archival research. But while memories of engaging with real documents at the archive are diffused and diffracted with reading and writing practices at the researcher's desk, what happens if the researcher only has access to online or published letters, often edited and inevitably selected? Since the digital revolution is well under play, we need to accept that in the future, more and more researchers will only have access to digitized or published documents, whether online or in paper. Even when we have the opportunity to visit an archive or a library, the analog manuscripts might not be available for reasons of preservation and protection. I have to admit that when engaging with manuscripts, notebooks, papers, and real letters of women mathematicians, either in the Ambrosiana Biblioteca in Milan, the Moreniana Biblioteca in Florence, the British Library in London, or the Bodleian Libraries in Oxford, I could not believe the fact that I was still allowed to unbox, touch, and flicker through such important documents without restrictions. I was almost feeling guilty that I was not asked to wear gloves, and I was frightfully apprehensive about the way I handled these documents. Above all, I was feeling really lucky that I was still able to do it. For how long more, though? I kept wondering. There is no question that the researcher's feeling of touching the imaginary real cannot be substituted by the visual or the digital. But since digitization is increasingly becoming the new real, we just need to accept it and get on with it. Thus, while considering the epistemological consequences of working with digitized documents, that of course we hope will become better curated, organized, and presented, the first thing to consider here is that wholeness, or the idea of touching the real, is never achievable anyway, even when working with analog or unpublished archival documents. You find nothing in the archive but stories caught halfway through, the middle of things, discontinuities, Caroline Steedman has influentially written. In this light, the letter that was kept and found in the archive should always be read with a letter that was lost or destroyed in mind, and in the same way that we interpret voices, we should perhaps start interpreting silences and absences, or somehow include them in our analysis and understanding. In the case of women mathematicians' letters, it is not only the differences between analog and digitized letters that we should consider, but also that many of their letters have only been found in draft forms, that many letters have been lost, damaged, or destroyed, and that even in several extant letters, we have very few traces of personal feelings and thoughts. And yet, multimodal, fragmented, and discontinuous as they are, and will always be, analog, digitized, edited, translated, and published letters have left traces of epistolary waves, which, as they ebb and flow, create a pattern that has a meaning in understanding the process of becoming a woman mathematician in post-Enlightenment Europe. Here, the researcher's imagination is important, and in my most recent book, I have used this motif of epistolary waves and rhythms in analyzing the letters of 4 revolutionary women in the 19th and 20th centuries. What is also important when working with fragmented letters and documents in the archives is that the researcher should not prolong and further obscure their fragmented state, but should rather attempt to mark and trace their archival trails in the process of reassembling the archive, as I have argued elsewhere in my work. Now, having gone through some of the epistemological challenges of working with letters in different forms, as well as different types of archives, I now want to share and discuss with you some of the themes and analytical topics that have emerged from my research with women mathematicians' correspondences. I have already referred to the importance of the epistolary relationship in the light of the dialogic and relational nature of correspondences. Mapping epistolary relationships was thus important in the analysis of the letters. A common denominator in all 6 cases was that women mathematicians were communicating with men, whether tutors, doctoral supervisors, fellow mathematicians, or even family members, lovers, and friends when writing about mathematics. And this is important in today's discussions around why there are still so very few women mathematicians, that men should take responsibility because they need to be part of these networks of promoting and supporting women's involvement. Now, the only exception was the correspondence between Mary Somerville and Ada Lovelace. And I have written a paper about this case and its importance in understanding the power of mentorship among women mathematicians. And following different women's associations in mathematics, I know this is a project they are trying to promote. What has also struck me in mapping epistolary relationships among women themselves is, for example, that Émilie de Châtelet and Maria Gaetana Agnesi, who lived more or less in the same period, one in France and the other in Italy, did not communicate with each other, although they knew of each other's work. De Châtelet's book was in Agnesi's library in Milan. De Châtelet wrote that Agnesi should be considered one of the greatest mathematicians of their times. They both became members of the Bologna Academy of Sciences through Laura Bassi, who was the first woman to hold a chair in the early modern period. So there were many links between them, and yet they did not communicate with each other. In the same way, Mary Somerville visited France in 1817, just a year after Sophie Germain was awarded the great prize of mathematics by the French Academy of Sciences. So Somerville went there with her husband. They dined and wined with the French scientific community. They were never introduced. She was never introduced to Sophie Germain. Although the people she dined and wined with were the same people who had awarded Germain her prize. So I want to look into these missing links and what would have happened if more connections could have been made. Now, epistolary education was an important theme in the analysis of these correspondences, and it was often the case that letters filled the gaps of most women's lack of rigorous mathematics education, as well as their exclusion from universities and formal learned academies. In this context, some of their letters function as educational and pedagogical tools in the circuit of knowledge production and dissemination, but also as flexible spaces of self-definition, as well as spaces of encouragement and disguise, sometimes even bracketing race, class, and age differences. We have already seen how Germain started communicating with Gauss under the pen name of a man. So many of the letters that women mathematicians received were instructional, carrying didactic epistolary characteristics. And as Marie-Claire Grassi has argued, the instructive letter is a literary genre in its own right. Roland Bonnel has further coined the term of la lettre laboratoire, the letter laboratory, in his work with Amélie de Châtelet's letters, suggesting that her letters should be taken as sites where she conducted experiments. Taking this idea further, Ariane Nicole Margolin has dissected the notion of de Châtelet's epistolary laboratory by meticulously showing how the laboratory, the site par excellence of the scientific work, was transposed within the context of the epistolary form. And if we are to understand the laboratory letter, we need the manuscripts, because the transcribed letters erase this messiness of the laboratory that you can see in the archives. So I guess the curators of the future, when they have such cases, they should somehow find a way of providing the transcription together with the messiness, because all this will be lost. What also transpires from women mathematicians' epistolary education is a spirit of agonism. And I refer here to agonism not in its usual connotation as struggle and contestation, but rather in its Arendtian configuration as affirmative action towards achievement, creation, and recognition in the world of science and mathematics in our case. As I have written elsewhere at length, the few women mathematicians that emerged in the early and late modern periods in Europe, there were basically 6, plus the Chinese one, 7, that we know of course, because that's what we have in the archives. So these women were not exceptional minds or geniuses, as the dominant discourses of their times have deemed them to be. They were simply hard-working minds in the wider process of what I have configured as the agonistics of knowledge and learning. So when I was working with the notebooks and letters of Maria Gaetana Agnesi in Milan, I could see how she was struggling with everything she was learning, and I could see it in her notebooks. And here again, the transcription, the clear transcription, wouldn't do the job. So here we have 2 examples of these agonistics and the polemic spirit of these letters. One comes from Amélie de Châtelet, who writes to her tutor in mathematics, who was a very advanced mathematician, Maupertuis, and she writes to him that although de Châtelet was a lover of Voltaire's, that's how she's usually known. So they were living together in her family chateau. They had their experiments there, And what Châtelet says here is that when there was a context from the French Academy of Sciences on the nature of fire, she did not agree with Voltaire about his approach because it was a Newtonian approach and she had already become Leibnizian. And so she lets him submit his essay, and she submits an anonymous essay with her own experiments that she was conducted at night without her lover knowing what she was doing. And actually, none of them won the competition. The competition was won by Euler. How could you, a rival with Euler? But nevertheless, because they were good essays, they were published in the Academy's proceedings. And Du Châtelet became the first woman to be published by the Academy of Sciences, which first accepted women in 1960s. So we just see some examples of this polemic that Grassi also talks. The polemic and the didactic, Grassi says, are epistolary traits of correspondences, and we can see them staged in some of the letters. The other interesting part is examining the temporality of the letters. So women's position in the educational epistolary relationship had variations and changes over time. So when Émilie de Châtelet started being tutored by Maupertuis, she was addressing him as her teacher, and she was a schoolgirl, an écolière, which was amazing if you think that she was an aristocrat and he was a layman. But as years advanced, he became her advisor because she had advanced in mathematics, and in the end, they decided to agree to disagree because Du Châtelet, as I said, had moved into the idea of Leibniz and the living forces, and Maupertuis was still a Newtonian. In the end, he went to Leibniz as well, but that's another story. So, as I said, salutations and greetings mark subject positions in the epistolary relationship. And perhaps "ever yours mathematically" is the best phrase I found in the archives at the Bodleian libraries. Ada Byron signs her letter to a young girl with this salutation, "ever yours mathematically," which I find particularly inspiring in terms of the women's tutoring and mentoring relationship that we have talked about, but also because the whole Byron Lovelace correspondence is very interesting because Ada is a young woman and yet very well-known and established mathematicians like Mary Somerville or Charles Babbage, the inventor of the machine, address her as "my dear Lady Lovelace." And it's also interesting if we go back to the importance of considering Epistolaria. Her husband addresses her as "dear kid" throughout the correspondence. I know that "dear kid" could be just an endearing address among a couple, but I have noticed that Ada is devalued both by her husband and her mother throughout their correspondence. And you can just see it by making the statistics of the salutations and the greetings. So, women mathematicians' letters unfold within then the dominant philosophical discourses of their times, didactics and polemics. But sometimes these polemics are ironies and silences, and that's the importance of tracing such silences in the correspondence again. And we have an extract here from Maria Gaetana Agnesi. She was the daughter of a rich silk merchant in Milan, and her father used her and her talented music sister to advance his social position because he wanted to become part of the nobility. So he was using his two daughters, organizing soirees in the Palazzo Agnesi, where people from all over the world would come to listen to the two sisters debating on philosophy and science and mathematics and playing the music that they had composed. And Agnesi's, and we see in this letter Agnesi's irony while she describes the evening at the Palazzo. She doesn't say anything against it, but we know she's up to, as a matter of fact, much soon after this letter, she developed a kind of illness. And she told her husband, I'm going to take the veil. Her father, I'm going to take the veil. And in the end, they accepted, they had a compromise where she could go on, but she would wear simple clothes, would not have to take part in this spectacularization of knowledge, and she would go to church whenever she wanted. So we have these underground polemics that also give us evidence of this process of becoming a woman mathematician. That is the point of my whole research. And of course, in their correspondences, we have intense emotions and feelings. And I think that the mathematical and scientific correspondences should become part of a trend in history now, right now, the history of emotions, and how important they were in creating subjectivities. And I have written a paper about love and mathematics in Duchâtelet's correspondence, where the rivalry and the struggle is not staged between her husband and her lover, for example, or the lover and another lover, but it's between the lover and her Newton. So on the one hand, you have the lover who wants her to be there. On the other hand, she has to write her book on Newton. And indeed, when she died, the translation of Newton's Principia and the extended commentary of it became the main translation for French people to our own days. So it's important to see how these emotions were playing out in the correspondences. So, to go back to the idea of the epistolary waves and rhythms in reading women's mathematical correspondences, I have used the lens of narrative rhythm analysis in discerning the echo of the subject. So what I argue is that we can't really have solid evidence of these subjectivities because we don't have the archives, we don't have the evidence. But these archival work and their letters let the echo of the subject being heard. And I have written a whole paper on rhythm analysis and the echo that comes from Laquella Bart's work. So, to conclude, what I have argued in this talk is that women mathematicians' letters and correspondences have been mainly discussed and analyzed in terms of the mathematical problems that they have tackled and addressed, as well as evidence of their overall contribution to the history of mathematical sciences. This is one part. The other part is that their letters have been purely discussed and analyzed as extravagant narratives of love, like de Châtelet. But what I argue is that the importance of considering their correspondence is in the meeting point of the personal and the scientific. And this letter, again, from Sophie Germain to her friend and fellow mathematician Guglielmo Libri, gives us a sense of this importance of the personal and the scientific. Again, it's a letter where they discuss mathematical problems, but in the beginning she writes, "I'm not surprised at your eagerness to renew conversations that cannot be found elsewhere than in Paris. All the doors are open to you. As I am not allowed to go to any sessions, I find myself almost as foreign to the movement of science as if I lived in another country." And yet, she goes on, "I'm still thankful for this, because this still gives me the opportunity to feel that I belong to this academic community." And this is, and they are these little fragments of her personal feelings that we can trace if we want to understand something about Sophie Germain's constitution, because she left no autobiographies, no diaries, nothing at all. So you have to go and dig into these letters to get some diamonds, like the pearl diver, as Hannah Arendt says, and of course use your imagination to create the narrative of this, of this strange phenomenon of what it meant to be or to become a woman scientist in post-Enlightenment Europe. Thank you.
So much, Maria. That was the incredibly rich and full talk. I think we talked about the sort of disappearance of certain types of engagement with the archive, which resonates very much with me since I work on ancient letters, and we simply don't have original manuscript copies of Cicero's letters. So we are dependent on the copies that were made over a long period. So it's really fascinating to think that we are now in another period where we are shifting from an original to the copy, and I think that's enormously fruitful. I'd like to open this for questions. If anybody would like to ask questions, perhaps while you're thinking. I have a very small question, which is about corrections. And I'm curious to know how much the letters show the writers making corrections as they go along. Are they kind of laboratories in that sense?
Yes.
That is visible, so they don't make fair copies to send to a correspondent. They are working in the letters.
They are working in the letters, but of course we know that some of these letters are drafts, because the actual letters that they sent were never kept, or because their archives, because that's a usual trend in women's archives. We only have their papers when they were communicating with an important man. So we go to the archives, and in the phones of famous men, we find letters of not so famous women. That's the deal. So, but sometimes we have drafts, and particularly with Sophie Germain, I have written a paper about it. There is a letter that is at the Moreniana Library where she writes to her correspondent, and she writes, "I have read your memoir with the greatest satisfaction." And then we see that she deletes the word satisfaction and writes attention. And now, and that's interesting, because we see that she does not want to use feelings or passions when writing to a mathematician. She wants to be formal. But the question that was raised by mathematicians, historians of mathematics in Zerman's case, is why is she so apprehensive when writing to Libri in 1826? She was 35 years older than him. He was only a 16 years old young man who had just graduated from the University of Pisa. Why is she so apprehensive? And the answer is, and that's thanks to the historians of mathematics, that the letter was not addressed to Libri. It was addressed to Poinsot, who was a very advanced mathematician of the French Academy of Sciences, and there was an error in the archive. But still, when I went to the Moreniana library in May, just in May last year, the letter is still archived as letter to Libri. So any researcher who goes to this real and very impressive, not like this, but equally impressive Moreniana will go with an error unless they have read the literature around Germain. And that's why, and that reinforces my argument about diffractions. That it's not enough, even when you go there and you touch the precious letter and you see the deletion and you say, oh, when I saw this letter transcribed, the deletion was not there. And you still have to read the papers around her to understand and find the context. So, and that's why I argue we should stop having this binary, the digitized versus the real. What's the real, really? You know, that our understanding is always diffractive.
Fascinating.
That's what I argue.
Comment, I suppose, then a question. Thank you. And I'm thinking about the young girls in our classrooms and how they should know about these women. And they, as a mathematician myself, and I remember when I announced at home that I wanted to study mathematics, my father said, it's too hard for a woman. I was enrolling the day after, obviously. And so, and there's two things I think why the young girls in our classroom should know about these things. And also because we think of mathematics as being, we talk about the elegant proof, don't we? And now mathematics looks nice and it looks neat. And actually, it's not born that way. The mathematicians want to achieve that elegance, but actually it's messy. There are deletions. So I really liked when you talked about seeing. So it's just a comment more than, but thank you very much.
No, it's a very precious comment because part of my project is really highlighting the importance of memory, not only in configuring the past, but also in prefiguring the future. So I think memory has this potential, this possibility, that we have to remember about all these women and approach them not in the usual way they have been approached. They were outstanding, they were exemplary, they were geniuses. Because if we put them in a pedestal, then young women, but also my international advisory board has given me feedback because there are many women professors in mathematics in this, and they say, oh, what you said about the exceptional woman is very liberating, because whenever we try to do something, we say, but we will never be Sophie Germain, we'll never be. And then when you say that they were just hardworking women, and the thing that they were put on a pedestal was because they, in the discourse, in the discursive constructions of their time, they had to be separated from them, from the usual women. So the idea was, yes, she was exemplary, but it was Maria Gaetana Agnès, she was almost a saint. And that's the important thing. about today. So I have created a website for this project where I use very simple entries in my website, and I also use a lot of portraits. I collect video clips, I collect short stories, because there are different areas of the website. So some parts of the of the website can be used in classes by lecturers and their students, but other parts of the website can also be used in the class. So you can just show a short film with Wang Zheni, for example, and then have a discussion with your school pupils about it. And yeah, because I'm also against the separation of the high scholarship and you know, the popular discourse.
Maybe just to follow up on the comment, I really agree with you that, like, down with the geniuses. But I also wonder, it's very common in discourse, in young girls' discourse, that the trope of success in mathematics for young girls is about being hardworking, not being a genius. I guess I wonder, I'm not sure what the question is, but I'm trying to formulate is it maybe dangerous to suggest that that the feminine trope that can hold some students back is that you are hardworking instead of genius? How do we, like, dissolve that kind of binary between male and female mathematicians, or you know, boys and girls in classrooms?
Yeah, I agree that there is this danger, but to be honest with you, and I'm saying this not because I'm a mathematician, but I live with a mathematician. Maths is hard. You have to sit down and work. You can't advance if you don't sit down and work hard. I mean, you can't do it in any area, but at least, you know, when the thing with maths is that because mathematical sciences have advanced so much, if you miss a certain period in your life when you can learn very important things, it's very difficult then to catch up with it. While in the social sciences, in the humanities, there is more room for making amends. And so what I argue, though, is that this idea that you need to work hard should be applicable both to boys and girls. This is where we have to work. It's not okay for a boy not to be working hard. This should be an imperative for both, that maths is about working hard. I have to say this.
This sounds like the message on which to end. So, thank you all very much, and thank you for taking time to come and join us this evening. This has been, as I said, an incredibly rich and stimulating talk, and really so full of things that we'll all be thinking about. So thank you again, Maria, so much.
Thank you. Thanks.